We're now going to move on to our discussion of the time periods. The first of the time periods is going to be the Archaic period, which is obviously the oldest. And archaic really just means old, so not very original, but there you go. And this is the time period that emerges out of the Dark Ages. So the Dark Age happens at the end of the Mycenaean period, and the Archaic is what first emerges as Greek culture in a sense. Just looking at the sculptures I have for you here on this page, you should note that the Archaic is going to have very basic art forms, and there's going to be a sense of developing right during this period. You don't see true naturalism until you get to the classical period. So we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get there. But this is really a development period. The people of the Archaic are trying to figure things out. But here's an important difference between, like, let's say the Greeks and the Egyptians. The Egyptians, they used the canon of proportions, a stable system for 3,000 years to depict artworks. The Greeks were very interested in the sense of change. So you're going to see very rapid change in their art pieces from the Archaic through all the way to the Hellenistic, their last time period. The sculpture I choose to show you here, again, I think helps take you on that journey. It takes you on that journey of trying to develop something, right? Trying to create something. And I chose to focus on 3D large-scale sculpture because I think that's really where the Greeks excel. One of the places where they excel in art making. I think the other place is architecture. So we're going to start by looking at large-scale Greek sculptures to really talk about this development of style. And I'm going to show you two different types here in the Archaic. First, I'm going to show you the male figures, the Koros figures as we call them, and then later I'll show you the female figures, the Korae. So Koros, male, Korae, right, female. And the Koros figures had a very specific purpose. Their purpose was to be grave markers. So these were meant to honor fallen soldiers. So they had a very, very specific purpose in why they were made. And comparatively to the Korae, the female statues, there were a lot of these made and very few Korae made. So again, I'd mentioned that this culture had a lot of stress on males, men, right, and the things that they did. So note that this fact upholds that, sort of belief in men being the focus of this culture. So these are sculptures that basically were meant to honor soldiers. And on the right, you see me in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And here I am as a scale figure showing you that these are indeed life-size statues. Now, I like showing you the Koroses not just for their purpose, but also to show you the development of style. If you're looking here at this Koros figure, you'll notice it's shown in a very, very basic way. Its body almost looks very stylized and very Egyptian, I'd say, influenced, right? These are things that we've seen before and thought about before when we've been talking about this idea of the body, right? So I'd say this is very Egyptian flavored, right, in its look. Jump forward about 30 years in the Archaic and notice that the same principles are applying here, right? But look at that development of style, right, over just that short amount of time, where the stance is the same. It looks still very Egyptian, but notice that now we're seeing muscles and softness. This is the key to really studying Greek art, this progression, right? This development of realism or naturalism that continues. You'll notice two different titles here, one based on the graveyard this was found in, which was the Anavastos graveyard. So we sometimes call him the Anavastos Koros, or Kroisios, which comes from an inscription on the piece that some people wonder if that's the name of this person or perhaps it was the name of the artist who made the sculpture. I don't really know which story is true, right? To me, calling him the Anavastos Koros makes a lot more sense because we do know the location, right, was the Anavastos graveyard. So we know that to be true. We're not really sure if this is Kroisios the man or, the artist's name or anything like that. So I think the first title makes more sense if you're thinking about titles and how to use them. And again, he was also a grave marker in the same spirit as the previous Koros I showed you. Now, sometimes you'd see Koroses made for a different reason, not very frequently, but I wanted to make sure to show you this because the calf bearer will actually have influence on a piece we'll look at later, right? So it'll have an influence on a piece that we're going to look at later during the early Christian time period, right? So when I show you the Good Shepherd later, you'll have to remember this piece and say, oh, okay, we've kind of talked about this a little bit. Now, what's the calf bearer doing? The calf bearer is bringing an animal sacrifice to the temple, right? So he's bringing this sacrifice to the temple. He's being a good, pious, right, religious person within the Greek system. I mentioned they did animal worship during this time period, so that's why the calf is going there. So he's bringing the calf to have it sacrificed for the gods. Because he's going to do something religious, notice that he is wearing clothes where the previous koroses I showed you were not. So sort of celebration of the body beautiful, as I mentioned, for those men. But if you're going to the temple, you definitely put clothes on. So a little bit of a difference here, thinking about him in a religious connotation rather than being celebrated as this magnificent fallen specimen, basically. And I'd mentioned that, of course, I would tell you a little bit about the Peplos Kore as a way to talk about the Kores, or the female statues. Now, the female statues were used as offerings to the gods, or to be specific, the goddesses, because women, goddesses, right, men, gods, just like priests and priestesses. So the Peplos Kore was actually found on the hill of the Acropolis. It had been buried under the ground when the Persians came and attacked Athens. We're going to talk about this event a little bit more when we get to talk about the classical period, and so I'll give you a little bit more context for this. But the Peplos Kore, we have her today because she was buried in order to protect her from the Persians when they came to attack Athens. Because of that, you'll notice there's still some paint in her hair and some remnants of the original coloration that you would see when you were looking at the sculpture. Now, why bring this up? Because I think a lot of people have a misconception about Greek sculptures and how they appeared. They see them in this very pristine white state and they think that's what they look like, but we know that they were actually very vibrantly painted, especially the ones that were placed up onto temples, for obvious reasons, because if you're down on the ground and you're trying to look at something up in the air far away from you, it doesn't make any sense not to have any coloration on those objects. You'd want these things to pop, and you'd want them to be able to be easily visually read. So painting was very much a part of decorating the sculptures at this time, especially the ones that appeared on architecture. So again, I think our vision of them is a little clouded by how we see them today, and I always try to show you the truth of these objects. So that's an interesting fact about this piece. Now, as I mentioned, she's an offering to the goddesses, in this case Athena, because we find her on the Acropolis in Athens. And notice that her hand was originally outstretched to give an offering, right? In this case, probably a piece of fruit, in order to say, I'm honoring the gods. As I mentioned, the Kores were less prominent as a production than the Koroses. There were a lot more of those fallen warrior statues made than the women that you see. And I'd mentioned when talking about the male-female angle that if you look at her, she's not shown sexualized. There's really no focus on the body. This was not a time when women, again, were being celebrated in a sexualized way. So we see a very specific way that she's going to be shown in contrast, right, to the way that the men are going to be shown. Again, if you look at all these statues, all these archaic statues, one of the things that you really can note is that they're still pretty stiff and static. They still have a lot of that Egyptian influence. And it's really going to take us talking about the developments in the classical to show you what you probably think of when you think about the Greeks in naturalism.